lovely people, welcome to another episode of Book Chat, the regular but not monthly roundup of what I have been reading at some point in the last few months.
Sophie Vlogs.
I have 5 books to talk about this time. I'm just going to dive into it, starting with... What am I going to start with? I'm going to start with Record of a Spaceborn for You by Becky Chambers. I adored this as I have adored all of the Wayfarer series. I've been calling it the Wayfarer trilogy, but I think she said somewhere that she's hoping to continue it, so I'm here for more books. Yes, 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 yes. Record of a Spaceborn for You is the 3rd book in the Wayfarer series. Each one of these books has taken place within the same universe. They're not necessarily sequels to each other, although I think it helps if you've read the other ones before you read these ones. But they're sort of like little snapshots. And what I really enjoy about this series is that it's sort of like in this book, there could be a criticism of this book whereby you say, nothing really happens, which kind of is true. But I'm so here for this, like, character-driven narrative where we just sit with some viewpoints and we just follow them and we get a sense of this world and everything, and it's just so fantastic. So this is focused on the Exodus fleet, which is the fleet which left Earth, went off into space. So a lot of the characters in this have always been a part of the Exodus fleet. You have contrasting viewpoints, so you have older people who it's all their life they've ever known. You have younger people who are like itching to know something different, and then you have a character who his ancestors were on the Exodus fleet, he's grown up on a planet and he's come back to it, and there's all of this questioning of, like, what does it really mean to be human? One of my favourite narratives of this is a character whose role it is to help people pass on, so to do funerals and to deal with death and that sort of thing. And all this discussion of, like, even though they've left Earth, they carry Earth within them, and the respect and due process paid to, like, people who have died, and turning those bodies into a part of the soil, a part of, you know, even though you've left Earth behind, if you put all your bodies under all the same conditions, they will decompose, they will become soil. All this stuff, this discussion of, like, how do you choose to live and how do you choose to die, and how do you deal with those things, and what makes you human, and all of these things. I got really into this. I absolutely loved it. I feel like it's going to be one that I'm going to reread because I'm going to want to touch back in every now and then and wrap myself in the comforting of this book and this outlook and stuff. And I can really see how this series isn't for everyone. I can see how if you are into sci-fi, you don't necessarily like this type of sci-fi, but I really love this type of sci-fi, so I had a really great time. After that, I'm going to talk about Gillespie and I by Jane Harris. This is sort of, I really don't know, I'm so bad at, like, book categorization. I want to say it's sort of a little bit of a thriller, mystery, historical fiction thing. Essentially, Harriet Baxter is telling us this story about how she became friends with the famous artist Ned Gillespie, and then the narrative is split between her as something like an 80-year-old woman in the present and what that life is like, and then looking back to this time and what that's about. Essentially, to be vague, there is a tragedy happens to the Gillespies. Harriet's involved in it. There's a trial. Shady things are going on. I enjoyed this book. I will say I really wanted this book to be at least 100 pages shorter than it was, because Harriet, from the off, to me, and I know that having looked on Goodreads, I know that not everyone had this experience, but to me, was a deeply unlikable character, which made me highly suspicious of everything she said. You know when you don't like a character, but they're your point of narration, and they come out with these statements, and I'm like, I've only got your word for that, don't I, Harriet? And so I was deeply mistrustful, which was fair, because one of my issues was Harriet hints very heavily at, there are a number of mishaps that befall the Gillespies, but specifically there is one real turning point that is their tragedy. And the narration hints so heavily at what this tragedy is that it rather takes off some of the suspense, because I knew what was going to happen, and I spent a lot of the narrative waiting for it to happen, and then after it happened, you're like, okay, now we can move on and we can get onto some stuff that I don't know what's going on. That's good. So, like, I know that other people had the opposite, where they liked the build-up, but they found the subsequent, like, trial and all this stuff quite tedious, and I do give you, it was a little tedious at times. But, I don't know, I just feel like there's a careful line to walk when you are trying to hint at things, but also not give it away, and if it's too easy to know what's going to happen, it does rather take the suspense out of it slightly. I will say I particularly liked the ending of this, because I felt like there's a lot of ambiguity about things, and you can read it either way, and then the ending came along, and I was like, okay, I see that. I see what we're being told by this moment, and I really enjoyed that. So I think that this was good. I'm not the biggest thriller-type reader anyway, so maybe that's just because sometimes their voice is a bit too predictable, and I get annoyed, I think. If you're looking for, like, a slightly historically fictiony, like it's set in the Edwardian time up in Glasgow with, like, the Grand Exhibition, stuff like that, with a thriller, with a mystery element, that sort of thing, untrustworthy narrators, I think this is a good book to read on that front. It's just the inherent problem with having an unlikable narrator is that you don't like them, and sometimes that's irksome. After that, I read the third book of the Earthsea Quartet, which is The Farthest Shore by Ursula K Le Guin. I am trying to work my way through the whole quartet in 2019. Who knows when this video is posted, but that's my aim now. I'm really enjoying the Earthsea Quartet. I think that Ursula K Le Guin, I really like this sort of like philosophy that is at the heart of this series, which is sort of this trying to find balance, and this not necessarily, like, you have some fantasy narratives where it's like light triumphs over dark, whereas this one I feel it's more like trying not to swing the scales too far and maintaining this balance in the universe, which I find really interesting as a topic to explore. One thing I will say slightly is, like, our main character Sparrowhawk, it's interesting because the first book in this series, and I'm going to talk about the series without any spoilers, but the first book in this series is him as a child growing up, engaging with his magical powers, that sort of thing. And then we very much jump forward to him as a much established mage and as essentially like a much older man. And it's weird sometimes because normally when you have these narratives, like, you follow them while they're young, and then you're sort of left with like I wonder what they did with the rest of their lives. Whereas we've really missed a whole chunk of his life, and we're just like, bam, now he's like an old dude. And it's like, that's also quite interesting to me to be, I don't know, I just find that an interesting character choice. Sometimes I'm a bit disappointed that we've missed out on a lot of that growth, but then at the same time, I think, I don't know, I just think it's quite interesting. I'm liking that the Farthest Shore sort of contrasts his sort of wisdom gained through time, that sort of thing, and now the accompanying character in this is that much younger, still finding their feet type figure. So in many ways that's really interesting because you can see all these parallels between, like, when Sparrowhawk was a child and when this guy is, like, you know, the mistakes of youth, the rashness of youth, all this stuff. Like, that's a really interesting contrast. I'm really interested to see how the fourth book goes. I think there's a fifth book in this series, if I'm not wrong. I'm going to have to look into it and see, because once this is done, I'm going to need to get my hands on it, presumably. But yes, this continues to be a really fun, interesting fantasy series, and I continue to wish that I'd read it when I was younger, because I would have absolutely adored it. After that, we have a book which I got from the Queer Book Box, book subscription box, and that's Pages for You by Sylvia Brownrigg. This tells the story of Flannery Jansen, who arrives at university, and then she essentially meets this woman, Anne, who is like her TA, and they develop a relationship. This book, one of the lovely things about this book is the writing style is very gorgeous. It's very, like, I don't know, like flowing and descriptive, that sort of thing. I found it really easy to just get lost in the writing of this. It's a very interesting little, like, potted history of, like, as it says on the back, the beginning, blossoming, and falling apart of that delirious love affair. It's like, this is like Flannery's, like, first love experience, and there's something so delicious about reading about someone else's first love, like, I don't know, like, all-encompassing, consuming, that sort of thing. Occasionally I felt like both characters lacked a bit of depth sometimes, I think, and I don't, having just said, like, I was all-encompassed by their love, like, sometimes I don't know. I sometimes just felt like I didn't really understand them as individuals. I sort of understood them in this context of their relationships to each other, but I didn't really get a sense of them as fleshed out beings. But then also that's sort of not really what this book is. So first to say, I really enjoyed this. I think I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars because I enjoyed it, but I didn't like fall head over heels in love with it. I would still really like to read the sequel, which is I think Pages for Her, and I think it's Flannery and Anne meeting later in life, because I also had mixed feelings about the ending of this book, I'll be honest with you. I don't know, I've got a lot to muddle out here, I think, but if you've read it, I'd love to hear how you got on with it, because I know some people who loved it, and I know some people who absolutely hated it, so I'd love to hear what camp you're in. Finally, I have a book which I don't have with me because I've returned it to the library, but I read Queen of Shadows by Sarah J. Maas. I think I'm like 3 years late to this, I don't know, I've lost track, I'm reading it at my own pace. I think I've had a similar response that I know a lot of people have, but just with slightly less intensity because I'm not quite as, like, in the moment of it all. Essentially, and this might go into slight spoilers with, if you don't want to know about, like, names, relationships, blah, 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 you should probably stop watching this now, because I am going to go into some spoilers, because I don't see how I can talk about, like, the 4th book in a series without spoiling some things. So, we're going to go into it. Essentially, I enjoy reading the Sarah J. Maas Throne of Jet Glass series because I'm really interested in this sort of like overarching grand plotline that we've developed. It's very different from the first 2 books in many ways. I think the first 2 books sort of were doing their own, I don't know, she probably had it all planned, but like in my head the first 2 books are quite a different narrative than what we're actually exploring now. And I'm really enjoying this overarching big picture thing. I felt like I don't really go to Sarah J. Maas for the relationship side of things, because I don't really care about any of the romantic relationships in this series. I do feel like if you do care about romantic relationships in this series, I can really see why you'd be annoyed, because I felt like there was some characterization that just felt a bit off for me. And, like, it's more that I feel like from the 3rd book to the 4th book we've had a bit of a jump, and it's quite convenient for plot reasons for certain people to be in conflict with each other, and that didn't read very true to me. And also, there's a relationship in the 4th book which was very platonic in the 3rd book, and I quite enjoyed that it was platonic. I was like, oh, cool, platonic friends, good stuff. And now we are suddenly it is suddenly an all-encompassing romance. And I just feel like there was a little connecting moment that was sort of missed, because I was like, I had to, like, mentally check. I was like, did I forget that this was a thing in the 3rd book? And no, I didn't. It just wasn't a thing. And again, like, I don't hugely mind because I wasn't attached to the other ships. But I just felt like there was some, like, very convenient characterization going on to fit some plot things. In the 3rd book, I didn't really connect with the Manon storyline very much, because I was reading it and I was like, I can see that we're being set up for something. But as that hasn't happened yet, I don't really get the point of this narrative. Whereas in this book, I do get the point of that narrative. I really enjoy that narrative. Those were some of my favourite bits in the book, and I'm really excited to see where that whole plotline's going. I also, essentially, there were some side characters that I was, like, totally here for. Much more than I was here for most of the core original characters. I don't really care about Aelin very much. She's not very engaging to me. I don't really read it for her. I don't really care about Kale very much. I felt like his characterization was a bit dodgy and grumpy, but, like, don't really care. Dorian has been a bit preoccupied. And essentially, side characters made this book for me. I think I'm gonna continue to just read it from my library, because I don't feel the need to own these books. But I am gonna check out the next book, I think. She always does this. I spend half of the book being like, I guess it's fine. And in the last, like, 200 pages, she's just like, and then everything happened. And I'm like, and now I want to read the next book, so I know what's going to happen. So that's where I'm at with that. Those are all the books I wanted to talk about this week. As per usual, have you read them? Give me your thoughts. Would love to hear them. Otherwise, I hope you're having a really lovely day, and I will see you next week for something different.